Hello everyone and welcome back to the channel. This is sort of an unofficial tack on to the reading section. The reading episodes that I've been putting out. I'm hoping to get the last part of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight out sometime this week, and as well as a review of Jack Vance's The Dying Earth, because that's the most recent science fiction novel that I read. But for today, we're going to be discussing one of my favorite characters one of my favorite characters in one of my favorite sets of books that I've read in the science fiction category in a long time, and that's going to be John Carter of Mars. John Carter is kind of a niche character. A lot of people don't actually know anything about him. I find he's a lot less known, obviously, than one of Edgar Rice Burroughs' more famous characters, which would be Tarzan of the Apes, because of course there was a Disney movie made about Tarzan of the Apes. There was a Disney movie made about John Carter too, but I don't think it got as much attention, or it is as beloved as the animated Tarzan film. But I wanted to talk about John Carter as a character and the stories that he appears in. And I want to frame this in such a way that you understand the character of John Carter and the stories that he is a part of as kind of a continuation of, and honestly I think it's probably the last great chivalric romance in Western literature. And hopefully that's not a hard sell, but I'll try to explain why I think that and why I think people should read the books. But I think before that, first of all, I should explain how I came to be familiar with John Carter, and then second of all, maybe we can talk a little bit about the background of the author and how he came to write this character. So I started reading these books actually last summer because I wanted to, if you guys have been following the channel for a while, you know that I started out doing book reviews of classic science fiction, because that's what I like to read. I like to read, classic 1950s, 60s science fiction novels. Actually, something that's down the pipeline is probably a review of The Canticle for Leibowitz, which I've referenced a few times on this channel, and is actually a fantastic novel from the Catholic perspective, which of course is, where I'm coming from. But I want to talk more specifically about John Carter. So I've already said that he's well, back up. So I've read the first 3 books of the Barsoom series, and those are the ones that are that feature John Carter directly as the main character. There are, I think, 12 books in total in the whole series, and John Carter is the main character in 4 or 5 of them. But the ones where he's a main character are the first 3, and then sort of way off in the series. So I didn't get around to those. And to be quite honest, I read the first 3, which are Princess of Mars, The Gods of Mars, Warlord of Mars, and then I started reading Thuvia, Maid of Mars, and it was not as interesting, and I got bored and put it down. I should say I got bored and stopped listening, because these were all audiobooks. And I do want to encourage people that if you don't have time to read, or you feel like you don't have time to read, and listen to audiobooks, because it's really not that much worse than actually reading the book yourself. And it's better to be sort of, becoming, familiarized with these works than, through that medium, than never hearing about them at all. And I pay pretty close attention, so I feel like I get as much from an audiobook as I usually would from reading the book. But anyway, that's a little bit of a tangent. So I read the first 3 books last summer, and the thing that stuck with me is that the character is very memorable, even though he really doesn't have much of a personality. And there are going to be light spoilers in this video, but nothing serious. But John Carter is kind of a force of nature, in the same way that, like, John Wick is in the John Wick action movies. A little bit less, extreme in that sense, because sometimes when you're watching something like John Wick, you have no idea why anything is happening, and it's just senseless killing, and you never really get that. You never really get that feeling when you're reading any of the Barsoom novels. Because as I said, John Carter is a chivalric character, but he's also not a super well developed character, and that's to be expected from the genre. Which, as I said, I think John Carter and the stories that he appears in are intended to be sort of late chivalric romances. So, but I want to talk first about how the character comes about, and I think this might shed light on how he becomes what he is, I suppose. So this gentleman here, this is Edgar Rice Burroughs. He wasn't necessarily the kindest or nicest or best person ever in the world. He certainly knew how to monetize his success, especially in regards to Tarzan. And like I said, if you ever talk to older people about the 30s to the 50s or 60s, Tarzan was big. People loved Tarzan. And Edgar Rice Burroughs was not shy about capitalizing monetarily on the success of his intellectual properties. But, more on that anon. This is before Edgar Rice Burroughs got super successful. This was 1910s or so. He was working at a pencil sharpener wholesaler. It was a really boring job, and he spent a lot of his time reading these really cringy pulp magazines from the time period. So I picked this as an illustrative example just because that is an absolutely cursed image on the cover, even though this is sort of a later magazine. But essentially it would be this sort of stuff. So you would have these pulp stories that were sort of campy, silly, sort of usually very smutty, and Edgar Rice Burroughs said, well, I can write something just as campy, just as smutty, but make it actually entertaining. And that's what he set out to do with John Carter, and I think he gained some success in that regard. And so you'll notice that the character of John Carter actually ended up being fairly influential in the history of science fiction. So if you take a look at this illustration from the cover of A Princess of Mars, which is the first book, you'll notice similarities to other characters in science fiction, like, for example, Conan the Barbarian. And you'll note that all these characters, like John Carter, like Conan the Barbarian, what sets them apart is that they are sort of the last great strongmen or alpha male protagonists. That's not to say that there are not characters in works past this that don't exhibit the same kinds of extremely masculine qualities, but it is to say that this is the last, I think, time in major popular fiction that you're going to have these really over-the-top, exaggerated masculine personas that are celebrated as honorable chivalric warriors, and I think that's incredibly apparent in John Carter when you read it. So what's the importance of this? What's the importance of the character and this sort of masculine quality that he has? Well, I think throughout the novels, what really comes to the fore is that there's a sense of sophistication that comes along with John Carter's masculinity. So he's not a complicated person. He doesn't have complicated motives. He's pretty much an open book, and all of his sort of goals or his personality traits even seem to revolve around completing quests, proving oneself in martial prowess and courage, and rescuing damsels. And that is what every story arc involves. And That's what he does. That's basically his character. But even though the story is not necessarily sophisticated, I think in some sense this displays a kind of sophistication or a refinement of the masculine virtues that he embodies. So, to give an example, he obviously is going to get involved with women because that's what knights do in romance tales. They go out, they go on a quest for a woman, and they win the affections of the woman, right? Well, in the case of John Carter, he does this throughout the first book. He rescues a princess from a kingdom called Helium. Her name is Deja Thoris, and they get married at the end of the first book. Like I said, light spoilers, but you knew that was going to happen. Immediately upon seeing the character and hearing the character described in the book, you're like, yep, they're going to get together. You know it's going to happen. But what's interesting is that in the second and third books, there are also these damsel characters. There's these female characters that become his sort of sidekick, that help him along, throughout his quest, whatever he's going to do. But notice he doesn't seem interested in them. They're always interested in him. And he is interested in them in some respect, but they're always sort of sexually interested in him, and he usually makes it clear that he is not available. He's married. He has this specific attachment to this one woman who he always goes on and on. She's the most beautiful. She's the best. Blah 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 blah. Well, okay, what is this? There's a masculine drive to rescue damsels, right? There's a masculine drive to get the girl. But in John Carter's case, there's a kind of sophistication there because he got one girl. He could easily get another one, but he doesn't, because his masculine drive to sort of possess beauty, so to speak, in the form of a woman, is tempered by his other virtues, by his loyalty, by his... Well, that's the main one, right? By his loyalty. And so what you get is a character who's not actually super multivariable, who's super complicated, and yet he gets into situations that you wouldn't expect just from the way that he comes across as this very simple sort of character. And I think it's interesting what background Edgar Rice Burroughs actually gives John Carter, and I think this serves as another connection to his origins as a chivalric hero. So John Carter used to be a captain in the Confederate Army. Now he's supposed to be immortal or something, and he's been around a long time, so nobody really knows what his real backstory is. But when you get a little bit of his backstory in the first novel, he tells you that he was in the Confederate Army, that he was a captain of some kind. And it's interesting why he would do this, because Edgar Rice Burroughs is not from the South. I think he's from Chicago. He's not a Southerner. So you're left with this question of, okay, well, if this is not a Southern pride thing, why would he do this? Well, it's simple. Of the two factions in the sort of American story, right, that up to that point, the South and the North is the egalitarian, the modern, the egalitarian and the modern faction of the two, whereas the South is regressive. And here's the interesting thing. The South is the aristocratic faction. And this is something I think even non-Southerners probably understood in the time period. So let me blow up this painting real quick so you can see it a little bit better. So this painting is called, what is it called again? Let me find it. This painting is called Let Us Have Peace. It is a depiction of Lee's surrender to Grant at Appomattox Courthouse. And interestingly enough, this painting was also not painted by a Southerner. This was painted by Jean-Léon Jerome-Ferry, who, despite the name, was from Philadelphia. And this was painted in the 1930s. And so it kind of illustrates the relationship, I think, that, the associations that Americans had with the South, namely with this sort of aristocratic warrior honor culture. Because if you look at this painting here, you'll notice that Grant, the winner, the successful general, he's got a coat unbuttoned, he's wearing a tie, he looks disheveled, and he's in the background of the picture. And in the foreground of the picture is General Lee, who is still, his boots are clean, he's still wearing his uniform with all the buttons done, and he's carrying his head with his chin up. And he's of course signing away, he's surrendering the Confederate Army. So what does this tell us? This tells us that within the paradigm of the early American zeitgeist, so to speak, the South and Southern aristocracy is sort of the continuation of these chivalric warrior, warrior traditions that we inherited from Europe. And this makes total sense. And this is why I think Edgar Rice Burroughs gave John Carter the background that he has, because he is supposed to be, like Grant, like this kind of honor-bound warrior. So let's get into the actual sort of meat of what John Carter does and how this ends up being, how this ends up connecting him to the chivalric tradition. So let me make this picture small again and go on to my next reference picture there. So I think there are three principal ways in which John Carter fulfills the archetype of the questing knight. So he shows up in a strange land, and the quest is usually undertaken on the behalf of some noble character. There's a king that wants his daughter back. There is the Green Martians, who he rises in rank in their tribe through his combat prowess. And he is always looking for characters of nobility, characters of standing, to complete some sort of task for them in order to himself increase in standing, increase in honor, increase in prestige, like any good questing knight. As I've alluded to before, there's always a damsel. There's always a woman who he must give his attention to. And if you're following along in my Sir Gawain and the Green Knight read through, this is actually something that's super important about the chivalric romance, is that the knight is under a kind of obligation to make the woman feel desired, to make the woman feel like an object worthy of love. This is actually how you get the concept of courtly love, where there are principles of Christian morality that can't be broken, like in Sir Gawain's example. He can't sleep with Lady Bersilac because that's adultery and that's bad. But he still has to play this game of making her feel wanted, because it's part of the knightly code. It's part of being a chivalrous knight. So, and then the third aspect is often how he treats his enemies. So the enemies, in a more modern depiction, I think, of John Carter of Mars, would have John Carter showing up in Mars, and he's got to get a lay of the land, and he's got to understand the historical grievances of the different parties of Martians and why these people act this way and these people act this way. And he has to be like this armchair sociologist who has to understand all of the intricacies and ins and outs of vagaries of the historical politics of Mars or whatever. But this is not that kind of story. This is the kind of story where he shows up, there's an obviously evil dude, and it's interesting because in the real world we tend to think there are no people who are obviously evil, but I would challenge people on that assumption. I don't think that's always true. But, keeping with the theme of chivalry and chivalric tales, he shows up, he identifies the villain, and even in there, there's a little bit of nuance, right? Because initially, the Green Martians seem like the villains, but then he comes to understand their warrior culture. He comes to understand, he comes to be respected by them, and so in that sense, they, like two knights who meet each other in the forest, right? And they come up and this becomes a feature of, for example, Edmund Spenser's Fairy Queen, where two knights meet in the forest and just randomly they gotta joust, they gotta fight, they gotta see who's better, and then when they fight, they're good. And this is how you know good characters is not that they don't fight each other; it's that they fight each other, they test each other's strength, and then they're like, okay, you're better than me. Let's be best buds. And that's how it kind of comes across in the first book when he's fighting with the Green Martians. Okay, but then, oftentimes this is how he comes about fighting other enemies, and the enemies that he fights are usually in themselves. They also have this sort of aristocratic background, or they are, in other words, it's a battle of equals, right? And if you wanted an example of how the novels sort of glorify and raise up a sort of aristocratic paradigm, a paradigm where men of good breeding, so to speak, are the ones fighting each other. You should really look at these scenes where, obviously, John Carter, because he's a soldier of helium, because that's where his wife is from. He's got to fight their battles, and there are usually these scenes where he'll break into a palace or something to try to rescue his wife, or his soon-to-be wife. I think that was the plot of one of the plot points in the first book, and he ends up massacring like rooms full of like petty nobility, like lords and ladies, not ladies, but lords and dukes and royal guardsmen and all these people, and there's usually some kind of line thrown in by Burroughs where he solemnizes the whole thing and he says, and the flower of whatever kingdom's society was cut out and bled upon the floor. Just something a little bit melodramatic like that, but it reinforces the idea that there are and in Mars especially, because Mars is a kind of Mars is the god of war, naturally, so it makes sense that the Martians are a warlike people. And Burroughs, I think like a lot of people of his time, saw that in the peace of the before the war period, that Western culture was starting to atrophy. And I think a lot of people desire to return to those sort of warrior traditions to prevent the West from atrophying and decaying. So this is you can kind of get hints of this in, like, for example, stuff that Nietzsche wrote. And I think Burroughs is kind of infected with this a little bit, because you'll see Martian society is by our standards, it's regressive, politically. However, this somehow he seems to communicate that this is a kind of eudaimonia, that there's a kind of stability and happiness, weirdly enough, that comes about through struggle in the Martian context that doesn't happen on Earth. That is contrasted, for example, with John Carter's experiences on Earth. And that's also part of the aristocratic sort of background of the character. There is an idea that sort of the aristocratic soul is the one that, the one that strives against the wilderness, the one that strives against the forces of nature and against other similarly inclined individuals. Going off on a little bit of a tangent, but I think you guys get where I'm going from. So I'm going to close out by saying that for these reasons and for others, I think, John Carter is a worthwhile read, especially for young men. So I would say 14 to 16, 14 to 18 would really enjoy these books because A, they're just flat out fun adventure romps with sword fighting and fighting on airships and fighting with guns that explode things, and it's just good action writing, basically. And of course, there's stories of romance and intrigue, but they're not actually, the romance plots are not actually that cringy. So that's kind of a refresher. And this is also a novel where men are in charge and men get to do what men do unapologetically. There's no reservations. Men just do what they do, and nobody says anything edgewise about it. Like, everyone understands that men have to fight, and they do it, and they do the fighting, and that's a lot of where the satisfying, that's a lot of how the setting and the story is satisfying. A couple of things I would say, although, before I end the novel, is that Edgar Rice Burroughs, and I think this became especially influential along with the character of John Carter. I think he partook in a particularly naive, in a particularly not very interesting critique of organized religion. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about this when I talk about The Dying Earth. But essentially, in the second book, heavy spoilers. So, if you're never going to read the book, you can continue listening, but otherwise don't listen past this point. But in the second book, it is revealed that the Martian religion, which says basically that when you're ready to die, you get on a boat, you go down the specific river, and you go to warrior heaven, basically, Valhalla or whatever. So it is revealed that actually what happens is all these people go to the land of this particular tribe of Martians who have been administering the fake religion of the Martians, and they get eaten or sacrificed in some way. And then it's revealed that the religion of those people ends up with them doing the exact same thing. So basically, it's not an interesting critique. It's the long-standing notion that religion is a form of social control and people don't question it. It's not very interesting. And it becomes increasingly less interesting like I said, in Jack Vance's novel, which I'm going to talk about later. But, other than that, and then, of course, other than, obviously, the male fan service and, the other things that you expect from John Carter as he is a specific reaction to, somewhat against, and somewhat in the same vein as the sort of the pulp science fiction tradition. You're going to get a little bit of that. You're going to get a little bit of smut. But it's not that bad. So my ultimate review is that if you want a good modern take, I think, on the traditions of chivalric romance that you can get in something like Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, or in the Arthurian legends, or in stories of the 12 Paladins of Charlemagne, or whatever. What are they called? The 12 Peers, I think. I would recommend John Carter, especially because it's in a cool science fiction setting, and there's not very many settings where you get sword fights and airships in the same setting. So, like I said, that's my recommendation, guys. Look out for my for the recording of the last part of Sir Gawain, and then my review of The Dying Earth later on this week. And then after that, I think I'm probably going to be reading some more Anglo-Saxon stuff, probably The Dream of the Rood and other Anglo-Saxon poetry. And after that, I'm not sure. But thank you guys for tuning in to the Hidebound Convivium on this glorious, well, it's a Monday today, but I don't know when you'll see this. And God bless and have a good rest of the day.